So good afternoon, everybody. And our webinar this afternoon, housing need or housing demand, what's the difference and why does it matter? My name is Quintin Bradley. I'm Senior Lecturer in Housing and Planning at Leeds Beckett. And we have a distinguished panel for you this afternoon. We have Dr. David Madden, Associate Professor at the LSE and co-author of the book In Defence of Housing. Peter Bill, a regular Property Week columnist and author of Broken Homes. We have Merle Gering, Freedom of Information campaigner, who will be talking about the ONS household projections. And Jackie Copley and Andrew Wood from CPRE, the Countryside Charity. So without more ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, David Madden. David, can I hand over to you?
Sure. So I just want to start by defining some of the crucial terms that we're using here. I want to argue that the distinction between need and demand sits at the core of the housing problem and is absolutely crucial both to making sense of what's happening in housing in societies like the UK, the US, and elsewhere, and also for helping to devise a proper response to it. So in order to do that, we need to understand what these terms mean. So just in a basic sense, let's start with demand, central to our discussion here. Demand, of course, as you all probably know, is simply the amount of money that consumers in a market are willing and able to pay for any good at a particular price. So the first thing you will recognize about this, of course, is that it's an economic category and not a social one. And it is a quantitative measure. It's something that economists estimate using house prices, income, perhaps the size of a dwelling, though not necessarily, and other information that's internal to markets. There's many different ways that economists estimate demand and imagine demand. It can be seen as unidimensional demand for floor space, or seen as the demand for a bundle of separate attributes. For any economist discussing housing, or any political economist discussing housing, the central category is actually effective demand. So effective demand just means demand as conditioned by constraints in other markets, in labor markets, in any other corner of economic life. So just understood in its most basic sense, demand is the question of what people can pay for housing. It is quantitative, it is calculable, it is individualized, and in theory optimizable. So you can find the sort of optimum point where demand will meet supply. It's also clearly fundamentally a reflection of broader economic structures, but these broader economic structures don't come into the picture when calculating with it. I think it's also important to recognize that demand is fundamentally agnostic regarding use. So it is not in any way tied to inhabitation. Demands can be for any purpose. Market prices will reflect effective demand, but say nothing about what housing is used for. So from the perspective of the market, the demand of an investor seeking a house to rent or to leave empty is indistinguishable from the demand of a family looking for a home. So that's just the basics of demand. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what need would mean. So need I'm defining as the quantity, location, form, and condition of housing that households require in order to fully participate in social, political, economic, and cultural life. I'll say that the term household itself is actually a bit of a synthetic concept, and there's a lot of complexity there, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But what can we say about need? First of all, it's relational. It's not an individual variable. It is fundamentally about people embedded within communities, embedded within social networks, embedded within social forms. It can't really be understood as an individual attribute. It's also constitutive. So housing is one of the conditions that allow people to participate in economic and social life. It's not merely good to be acquired from within economic life. And so the need for housing conditions all of the other ways that any economic and social actor will interact with a market. Need is also multifunctional because people need housing for an infinite variety of reasons for shelter, for social life, for supporting creative endeavors, for creating a private sphere, for participating in public spheres, for a whole host of economic, cultural, symbolic, and political reasons. As a result, need is unoptimizable. You can never find an optimized distribution of housing in order to meet need. There's really, in essence, no limit to need. People's housing shapes the horizons of their lives. So in essence, it can always be improved. What need does have is a lower limit under which housing can prevent people from participating in important aspects of social, political, and economic life. And it is a basic fact of housing systems today that millions of people worldwide are living below this limit and are being prevented from participating in social, political, and economic life as a result of their housing. The other thing to say about need is that it has to be conceived of as independent of the ability to pay. Housing need ultimately is interestingly both completely idiosyncratic and incommensurable, because we all need different things from housing, but also completely universal. So it's not conditioned on one's economic circumstances. There's a universal social need for housing. And let's go to the next slide. Recognizing that there's a universal social need for housing, I think can point to a fundamental problem at the core of housing markets, which is that they only respond to effective demand for housing. They do not respond to the social need for housing. And I think this is really crucial. I think any conception of housing rights or housing justice needs fundamentally to be pitched towards trying to reorient the housing system towards responding to social need rather than effective demand. But under the current model, where housing is becoming increasingly financialized, where it's treated more like a commodity, where it is being determined more by financial actors, the opposite is occurring. So housing markets are becoming more responsive to the needs of investors, more dominated by investor strategies, less responsive to social need. So I think this is the core of the problem. Let's explore some of the facets of this issue. And you've already gone to the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, I think that we need to consider the impact of non-residential demand. So by non-residential demand, I mean investors, speculators, second home buyers, purchasers of holiday lets, anyone who's trying to purchase housing for purposes other than having it serve as home. A big part of the problem is that housing markets increasingly respond to non-residential demand and are shaped by non-residential demand. Now, this is a very complex and uneven problem. It involves huge institutional investors or private equity firms, like Blackstone being only the most notorious, but far from the only one, and because they're the world's largest landlord. It also involves small-scale housing investors. The problem of non-residential demand is something that also has different geographies and different temporalities than the use of housing for living. So unlike households, non-resident investors can scour the globe looking for opportunities. Today's investors use real estate apps, machine learning, other kinds of fintech in order to facilitate their investment strategies. Now, there's a lot of debate about the size and impact of non-residential investment. It clearly varies by locality, by tenure type, by many, many other factors. But it's also clear that in many places, investors and other non-residential purchasers of housing are becoming highly influential. So just a story that was in the FT today was reporting that in the fourth quarter of 2021, in the US, investors bought more than 18% of all the homes that were purchased. And there are many housing markets in the US and in other countries where institutional investors own more than 30% or 40% of all housing units. There are some places where financialized housing actors and institutional investors are incredibly important players in housing markets. This translates, first of all, into rising housing prices. It also has a political impact in that it is a way that investors and landlords exercise market power and have some degree of price setting power. I think the growing levels of non-resident investment also mean that many approaches to solving the housing problem cannot work as they are proposed. So there are many people today who say that the solution to the housing crisis is to deregulate housing and let house builders build as many houses as they want to following price signals, and that will solve the problem. But it's clear that unless all of this construction is embedded within a larger strategy orientated towards housing need, nothing's going to prevent investors and other powerful market actors from simply buying more of this housing that is produced. Ultimately, non-resident investment means that house prices are not reflections of need. House prices reflect, among many other things, the supply of money and the supply of credit, returns on investment available in other economic sectors, the structure of real estate capital, the state of real estate technology, the animal spirits of speculators, and many other factors that have nothing to do with housing need. So the existence of non-residential demand is very concretely a way that social need is marginalized within the housing system. Let's go to the next slide. Another facet of the problem is the insufficiency of effective demand. So the problem here is that effective demand does not capture all the housing that is needed, especially on the lower end of economic hierarchies. So a recent report from the National Housing Federation found that 8.5 million people in England have some form of unmet housing need. And if you look around, the signals of housing need are everywhere. It can be found in households stuck in unaffordable and expensive dwellings, in insufficiently large dwellings, in poorly maintained dwellings, in housing located in the wrong place, etc. It was recently reported that 84% of tenants in London pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And this is a reflection of unmet need for affordable housing. In the US, there's not a single state where a worker on minimum wage can affordably rent a one-bedroom flat. But when the ability to pay is all that matters and there's no regulation of prices, markets can effectively ignore this vast housing need. And there's no way in which this component of housing registers with the people who are constructing and distributing housing. So let me just wrap up with the last slide, or the next slide. What is to be done about all this? I would argue that it is clear that there's a world of difference between effective demand and social need. Millions of people, especially but not exclusively poor and working class households, need more and better housing than they can afford. But this simply doesn't register with housing markets. Far from responding efficiently to the need for residential space, housing markets today allow investors to turn a profit by squeezing more money out of existing spaces, by destroying existing affordable housing, or by acting in other ways that undercut or undermine housing as living space. If housing justice or right to housing means anything, it must mean orientating the housing system towards need rather than demand. The solution must involve the decommodification and democratization of housing. Housing need will only matter for the construction and distribution of housing when there's some form of social intervention in markets, and the construction of housing alternatives that don't follow market signals. So you can go to the very last slide, and I will leave it there. Thanks a lot for listening to my talk that I've now done on the telephone. Sure.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That was a brilliantly clear definition of terms, and thanks for that. So we're going to turn now to Peter Bill, and Peter's presentation will take us into the realm of housing supply and housing affordability, so follows on nicely from David's specification there.
Thank you very much, Quentin. I have to say David's introduction is almost perfect in its explanation of what I'm going to go into in a slightly more granular and less academic way. As David said, there isn't really an answer to the housing crisis, especially on supply and demand. It's not peculiar to the present, as he says in one of his books. And the oppressed in Britain will always be oppressed, and there will always be a crisis for those who are oppressed. When it comes to supply, I think that demand. Sorry, I think one of David's colleagues, Christine Whitehead, has said it's very foolish to look at the demographics on their own. You can try and work out whether it's going to 1.7 households and this, that, and the other, but I think it's best that you have to look at it because household formation is affected by income, which is sort of what David was saying. And I think when it comes to the price of houses, I don't think supply of fresh houses has much to do with the price of homes at all. If you imagine a field with, I don't know, 28,000 daffodils in it, if you like, to represent every 1,000 houses in Britain, if you plant, I don't know, 200 more daffodils in the field, does that bring down the price of daffodils? No, it doesn't. If you plant 300 daffodils in the field, does it bring down the price of daffodils altogether? Of course it doesn't. The fact is the price of new homes is actually hooked to the price of old homes. It's not very difficult to work that one out. And what I will try and argue in a minute is that it's the crisis of affordability which is really the issue. And again, as David was sort of hinting, the bottom fifth can afford almost nothing. They're not in it. They are what we call in the book I've written, they are the ghosts in the machine. They can't do anything. They're not thought about. Their needs aren't met, and they probably never will be. If we can just go on to the next slide now, Quintin, I'm just going to plug my book for a second or two with my esteemed co-author, Jackie Sadek. You can buy it on Jeff Bezos's book site. Jackie is somebody who trod the path from regeneration expert to ministerial advisor to a real life developer. And it's written really to try and bridge the gulf in understanding between those who build houses for a living and those who think those that build them are capitalist running dogs, if you like. A bit like Mr. Gove feels about every house builder at the moment. And the faults that we've uncovered in the book really are there is a widespread political incompetence, and I'm talking about at ministerial level, I'm talking about at civil service level, and I'm not talking about either Conservative or Labour. It's just widespread. We are not in the days of CP Snow anymore. There are no corridors of power with people who are competent enough to stride them. I think the main factoid that we go into is that more homes equals lower prices, which it doesn't, and I'll come to that later. And the main fix that we came up with, which is that we should have minimum, for decent homes, we need a level of minimum floor sizes and maximum densities. So that's slide 2, plug over, and we'll now move on to slide 3, which is this is the private sector, the supply from the private sector. We'll come on to the public sector in a minute. I've just chosen the top half a dozen house builders there and put the others underneath. The figures are slightly old because they're out of the book, but I think things are much the same as they were in 2019. I'd like to try and dispel a few myths. One is these guys do not hoard land, but they do hoard sales. So I'll come to why they hoard sales in a minute. There is a whole substrata of people beneath these people who do in fact hoard land, trade land, make land better. But the guys here don't hoard land. That's not what they're in the game to do. It can take between 8 or 9 years, 6 to 9 years from land purchase to the final sale. That's why they need lots of land, so they can see ahead. They're always watching to see if prices are going up and down. And I think what they do is to, on the land side of it, they do make a fortune, these people. Most of them nearly went bust in the crash. Between 2012 and 18, the 8 of them, that's 6 plus those 2, made nearly £16 billion in profit. So they are making a fortune, and the golden years are continuing. They're making between 15 and 30% margins now, and Help to Buy is essentially turned into Help to Profit. It's coming to an end, I hope, but they are still going. So if I just come on to the next slide, Quentin, if you wouldn't mind. That's it. As I said earlier, it can take from 6 or 9 years to get from buying the land to getting the last house site. And so you can see these guys have about 4 or 5 or 6 years supply for the reasons I've just mentioned. They carefully control the number of outlets that they have. They don't tend to go up very much. And that final figure you can see on the end there, that mysterious spow thing, that is the regulating valve for the supply of houses from the private sector. What it means is that the whole business model of a Barratt or a Persimmon is based upon selling 0.7 or 0.75 or 1.2 houses a week per site. So it's sales per outlet per week. Everything stretches back from that to the price they pay to the land. They know that that is the right figure. It has been for many years. That allows them to work at maximum efficiency, having just enough capital, having just enough labour, having just enough materials. 0.75 a week. Been like that forever. Now, they regulate that to 0.75 a week quite easily. What they do, if they release the houses in small batches, and if they sell quickly at more than 0.7 a week, they put the price up of the next batch to slow down the price. If they don't sell at 0.7 a week and they're hanging around, they don't bring the price down, God forbid. They start to introduce free kitchens and things to speed up the sale. And the whole idea is to keep it between those figures. That is the valve that controls housing supply for most house builders in Britain today. Right, if we could just move on to the public sector now, Quentin. The next slide. The public sector. Well, what can we say, really? It's becoming almost irrelevant to the supply of new homes. The number of new homes supplied to the bottom end of the market is about, for social rent, 6,000–7,000 a year. It's an almost irrelevant number. As you can see, most of the numbers are going for these affordable rent houses and for shared ownership. The vast bulk is either affordable rent or shared ownership. And as I will show you in a minute, affordable rent means anything but to the bottom 20–30%. It's not affordable for them at all. So they're not really in the game when it comes to upping supply. If we just go to the next slide, Quentin. Now, I've just pulled out, like I did with the house builders, these are the top housing associations. Well, if you have a look, they produced, I don't know, I think it's 16,000 houses altogether in the year. Some for social rent, but again, the vast bulk for low cost ownership and shared ownership. And they just sell them, you know, they sell half their stock. The problem housing associations have today is they're debt laden. Thank you to the 2011 administration onwards. They've allowed them to raise money rather than give them money. So they've got huge debts. They do a terrific job of looking after poorer folk on their legacy estates. Nobody would deny that. For that, we should rejoice. And for those who work for them selflessly, they should be applauded. But to suggest they can help solve Britain's housing crisis is a delusion. It's a delusion that encourages a piece of research I saw last week, which said if only the sector were given 34 billion, they could somehow build 95,000 homes a year to meet this chimerical 300,000 target. They can't. They won't get the money. They're not built to do it. As you can see, the top 10 under 16,000 homes a year, and only 2,000 were affordable. The other issue that housing associations have is they're hogtied to the private sector now, because the private sector build most of their houses for them and they buy them off them, and they buy them off them in blocks of flats that have been located where house builders want to sell private flats and are forced by local legislation to include affordable in those flats. So these houses might not be where the poorer folk would want to live, but they have to live. They always get the worst ones. They get the ones facing the road. They get the ones that they don't do pour doors anymore, but they get a raw deal. They get a raw deal. Right, if we come to affordability now, just a couple more slides to go. You probably can't see those numbers, and by God, it took me a long time to get them together. But essentially, the bottom fifth of the British population, that's 13 million people living in 6 million houses, can't afford a mortgage. They can afford up to about 100 quid a week in rent, if they're lucky. The next fifth, I'm having to squint at it myself now. The next fifth, the 13 million who live in 6 million houses with a disposable income of 22,000 a year. Sorry, the other lot were 13,800. They can just about afford a mortgage of 80,000, which is where they scrape into buying 25% of a flat somewhere. And mortgage outgoings of 600 to 700, 800 quid a week. The next third up, this is the middle fifth, as I call them. These are the ones that you will find complaining. These are the people on sort of disposable incomes of it. This is household incomes, by the way, and it's disposable, not gross. Disposable incomes of about 30 grand a year. They can afford 10,000 a year on their mortgage. And that will cost them £800 a month or so. And so they can afford 135 grand, 140,000 quid for a house. Outside in the southeast, that's not enough, but outside the southeast, they're in the market. And the top two groups, well, I don't really care about them, frankly. They can afford houses and let them get on with it. Let them get on with it and stop moaning. Right, the second to last slide. This is what you find if you go and have a look on housing association websites. It's like another world. If you're poor, don't go and look on a housing association website for housing. Look for a one-bed flat in Clapham. It's not 1,400. It's not 1,140 a month. It's from 1,140 a month. That will be the studio flat on the main road. That won't be the penthouse flat. That's London. If you go up to Manchester, you can buy a 35% share of a flat in Media City, but it's from 54 grand a year, which means there'll be one studio flat at 54 grand a year. Wetherby, 90 grand a year. If you want, this is in York, there's a housing association building some flats there. You can actually buy an outright studio flat from them. It's 174,000 quid for a studio flat. These are being built by those who are supposed to help people on the housing ladder. I won't go on. You've got network homes in Colindale. You've got brand new luxury living at Barking for 1,500 a month. All I would say is I'd spent about half a day looking through housing association websites. I would hate to have done that sitting here with my wife and two small children looking to find something for 600 quid a month. It's just not there. It's just not there. New, we're talking about new now. Don't forget, I'm not talking about the old. Right, this is the final slide. This just got me. I think this just got me the most. If you just read through it, this is how housing associations are proudly selling their stock. There is no need for you to leave home for your barista coffee. Our club, you can sign up to the Brewer app. Freshly ground beans will deliver the perfect cappuccino to you directly. Work and play will be made seamless. Co-working spaces are featured. You know, and I thought, how far away have we got from what housing associations were supposed to be doing? You know why they're doing it. They're being forced into doing it. That's not the point. But how far away have we got? In the 80s, they were revived. They had philanthropic intentions. but they've now been slowly crushed by debt, and now, you know, Grenfell is meaning they're having to fix some of the flats as well. So today, what do we have? Don't have any council houses. We have very little housing association stock. It's tied to the skirts of the private sector, who, as I said, build at their own pace. So that's where we are now. I don't think there is any solution on the horizon beyond doing what we mentioned, the conclusion we came to in Broken Homes, which is if you want to house poor people in decent homes, not in one-bedroom studio flats, you have to buy the land at agricultural land prices or sequester the land at existing use prices. It's how the housing, and then you have to build council houses on them. They're just effectively council houses. They can't be built by councils because councils can't build houses anymore. They don't have the staff. You have to build houses about half the local average wage. You can just about afford to do that if the land is agricultural land prices, but you then have to rent them in perpetuity. Otherwise, somebody will come along and grab the increased land value. Until that happens, we're stuck where we are. That's it from me. Thank you, Dr. Quintin.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Some brilliant statistics and data there would be really useful for everybody, I think. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass over to Merle Gering now, and we're going to move from talking about housing supply to looking at the methodology behind planning for housing supply. And Merle's going to talk to us about the Office of National Statistics and their population data.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is a talk about the reliability of ONS population figures. And another way of putting that is, can you trust ONS? And I'll give away the story, right at the start. This is about how bad data doomed the Warwickshire countryside, and ONS would not do anything about it. Next slide, please. So this graph here really tells the whole story of what I'm going to show to you. This graph shows the ONS 2014 predictions for population growth in and around Coventry and in the West Midlands. So all those bars on the graph are the different towns in the West Midlands: Birmingham, Solihull, Sandwell, Warwick, Leamington Spa. There are loads of them. And the thing that leaps out at you is that the big red line at the right-hand side is towering above the rest. That's the line for Coventry's growth over a 20-year period. And here is ONS telling us that Coventry is going to grow far faster than any other town in the area. So the question arises, like, anytime you see something which is sticking out like a sore thumb, if you're doing modeling, or if you're doing sampling, or any kind of experiment, if something is unexpected, you have to ask yourself, well, is it real or is it a mistake? So this talk will explore the question of how did we test that proposition? Is there any reality to this prediction? And the important thing to remember is that most local plans and housing need figures were based on the 2014 subnational population projections. ONS likes to claim that they're projections and blah, 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 and they're not predictions of the future, but actually the whole world uses them like forecasts. And so that's the important way to think about this, that ONS is forecasting an extraordinary massive population growth in Coventry, unlike its neighbors who are right next door. And the other thing to note in there is that the growth predicted for Coventry is nearly 32%, and the regional average predicted is around 12%. So it's 250% times faster than the regional average. And you just have to ask yourself, really? Next slide, please. So here are some questions, ways of putting this. Is it credible that Coventry is growing twice as fast as Rugby or Birmingham, 3 times as fast as Solihull or Warwick, and 4 times as fast as Stratford. And by the way, the fancy homes and the jobs growth have been in Solihull, Warwick, and Stratford. So you have to ask yourself the question, is this remotely possible? And then you ask, did ONS ever ask this question, or did local planners ever ask this question? We challenge them on it time and again. And nonetheless, Coventry Council, they just swelled themselves up with vanity and pride at how they were going to be the fastest growing place in the country after London. But they could never answer the question, well, why? Next slide, please. So here we go. If something unusual is going to happen, there must be an explanation for it in the real world. Has gold been discovered? Do we have a new university or a big military base or some tech industry taking off? Do we have a new Silicon Valley here in Coventry? So we ask these questions, tell us why. Show us what's going to account for this phenomenal, extraordinary event which you're predicting here. And there was never any answer, not from Coventry City Council, not from ONS, not from MHCLG. No one ever had an answer. They just thought, no, we can walk on water. Computer says, must be so. Next slide. So we asked the question was, all right, is there any evidence of a population boom here? You'll see it. If the place is absolutely overcrowded, jam-packed with people, if you can never get a parking space, if the roads are always completely overrun, if the school, you can't get admission to a school, there'll be signs of population growth. It leaves its traces in the sand. So we said, let's look for those traces. Next slide. So the first thing to look at is to say, well, what happened in the recent past when we have pretty good records between the last 2 censuses, between 2001 and 2011, over a decade, which was the time when there was a big rush of Polish and Lithuanian immigrants into the UK. So you might think, well, it's an immigrant phenomenon. But here we go. This graph shows the population growth as a percentage for all the West Midlands towns. And during that decade, when there was rapid international migration, growth in Coventry was just average over a 10-year period, just 5%. So there's no historical evidence that people were being drawn to Coventry. There was no magnet here, no free homes, no high-paid jobs, no North Sea oil boom. There wasn't anything happening up to 2011. So next slide, please. And then the other thing that you think was, well, why do people move home? Why do they, migrate to a new place? You say, well, it's jobs. That's the thing that usually attracts people. So this graph shows you more recent data up to 2019 about jobs growth in the West Midlands. And I looked at it in 2 different ways over 2 different time periods when there are 2 different data sets, one starting in 2004 and the other starting in 2011. But either way you look at it, the red line in the bang in the middle is for Coventry. And you can see that, there was rapid jobs growth in Tamworth and in Warwick and in Rugby on the right-hand side of the graph, or Solihull. But, Coventry was not the place to come to if you were really eager for a job. So it isn't employment growth up to 2019, which is producing any kind of massive population increase. Next slide. Well, now we start looking at all the other kinds of data which you can find if you hunt around on the internet. And I thought a very interesting proxy for population is A&E attendance. So this graph shows the percentage increase at various trusts around the West Midlands. This is not local authority level data, but it roughly correlates with local authorities. The Coventry and Warwickshire, NHS trust, covers Coventry and a bit of Warwickshire as well. But you can see that the red line is for the Coventry trust, and there's no huge increase in people going down to A&E for broken limbs or heart attacks or strokes or anything else you would go to A&E for. So there's no evidence there of a huge population explosion. So next slide, please. Oh, this is a really interesting one, which starts to tell you what's going wrong with ONS and their model. So this graph shows birth data starting in 2011. So if you look over to the left-hand side, the blue line shows actual births. Every single year, the NHS and ONS jointly compile birth data, which is done on an annual basis. And you can see that from 2011 going forward to 2012, 13, 14, births are actually declining in Coventry. I mean, from about 5,000 per year, going down to about 4,500. Very steady, gentle decline. And then that blue line goes on decreasing on up to 2019, which was when was the last date I had for this matter. So you can see there's a very clear downward trend. The red line shows what ONS is forecasting for the future. And you'll find that forecast in the 2014 subnational projections. And you can see that red line, instead of reducing, is actually accelerating upwards. And you have to ask yourself, what is ONS doing? Why have they decided that births are going to rise upwards at a fairly rapid rate when the real historical trend is downward? And they have gone on predicting large numbers of births in Coventry. So at the present time in 2019, their forecast is about 1,000 too large per year. So you can see over 20 years, that's going to inflate a population forecast by about 20,000. So ONS is doing something different. I don't have time to get into it, but you can see, there's something wrong here. Next slide, please. Here's another proxy. I think quite a cute, popular one, numbers of cars registered. That, by and large, this is just my rough and ready assumption that in a place which is growing rapidly in population, you're going to see more cars too. Cars are so ubiquitous. People want to have cars. I think about a third of the population doesn't have them, but nonetheless, it's a rough and ready indicator of what's going on. And there you go. You see Coventry is over to the right. It's got a pretty good increase in the number of cars, but it's not very different from other places, Rugby or Wolverhampton or East Staffordshire, or Solihull. There's nothing really special happening in Coventry. So once again, no sign of a population bubble. Next slide, please. All right, this is, I think, quite a good proxy for population growth. It's domestic electricity use. So you can find out the amount of electric used, in each local authority, and it's separated out by commercial and domestic, so you can see what's used in homes. It's not influenced by commercial uses. So virtually everyone uses electricity. So once again, if you had an anomalous population bubble, you'd expect to see, an anomalous increase in electricity consumption. But the thick brown dashed line up near the top is Coventry. And you can see that the trend in Coventry is the same as its near neighbors. The top blue line is Birmingham. The yellow line, is Bromsgrove. There are lots of others, but there's no spike in Coventry. If you had suddenly lots more people arriving in the city, you'd think, the line should lift upwards. You'll have an increase in electricity consumption. All of them are declining because of efficiency drives. You'll remember that our electric companies used to send us, low energy bulbs, and the efficiency of domestic devices increased over the last decade or so. That's what's going on as a general phenomenon. But there's no different trend in Coventry. There's no change in the gradient. Next slide, please. And this one looks at domestic gas in just the same way. And once again, that heavy dashed brown line is Coventry. And the trend in Coventry is exactly the same as its neighbors. There's no indication of a liftoff, no indication of a spike, which is what you would expect if we were seeing, a massive population increase here. Next slide. And we just looked at everything we could find. We could find data about another proxy for population is the number of voters, and it's the same story. This is all voters, so it will include Eastern European migrants. It shows that in Coventry, the trend is very similar to its neighbors. There's no chance, no sign that vast numbers of people have arrived here and have registered to vote. So it won't be everybody. Doesn't include children, doesn't include non-EU nationals, but it's an indicator, and it's not showing us anything. So one more thing that's not showing anything. Next slide. This is school admissions. Quite a complicated graph, but anyway, the heavier dashed lines, the green and the kind of khaki colored lines in the bottom third of the graph are Coventry. The green one is primary school admissions, which are now declining and they're closing primary schools. The khaki one is for secondary schools. There's rather more data available for secondaries, but both of them don't show us anything special. I mean, if you look at the graph carefully, you'll see that secondary admission in Birmingham has taken off. Maybe there's something happening in Birmingham, but it ain't happening in Coventry. So schools and large family sizes or high fertility in Coventry does not seem to be a cause of this imputed population growth. Next slide. Well, so that's the kind of administrative data. You also looked at well, what do the hard-headed businessmen think about it? Is Coventry a place to make some money by building houses? So this rather very overcomplicated graph looks a bit like Christmas tree decorations. Tells you about housing starts over a long period of time. Can't quite read the bottom line. It's about 20 years, maybe longer. But if you can't focus on the right-hand side of the graph, the kind of olive green solid line is the housing starts in England over more or less the last 10 years. So that tells you, all right, there has been more housing built in the last 10 years after the crash in 2008. And the kind of purpley blue dashed line below it is the graph for Warwickshire. So once again, in Warwickshire over the last 10 years, there has been a good increase in the delivery of homes. But then you say, well, what about Coventry? Do the builders think, yeah, there are loads of people in Coventry, we should build houses there, make lots of money? But the housing starts for Coventry are buried in the bottom of the graph. They are actually a very heavy reddish brown line. You can see it again in that period, buried in amongst all the others. There was no bonanza in house building in Coventry. The builders didn't think, yeah, this is the place to do it. Let's get on with it. We can make money here. We got customers here. So next slide, please. And this is another way of looking at the same thing. This graph shows you affordability of lower quartile homes. It compares the price of housing to salaries in the lower quartile. And Coventry's right in the middle. The prices are not accelerating here. If you had loads and loads of people chasing housing, you'd think, right, the prices would be driven up. It would be an expensive place to buy a home. But no, it's actually a very affordable place. It's one of the most affordable places in the country to buy a home. Next slide. So this is just a little summary. I asked the question, who are the hordes of people moving into Coventry, which ONS tell us are here? They say they're actually here. It's not just a projection. Every year in the estimates, they have the same kind of line of huge increases year on year. And the council goes on trumpeting about it in the same way. Oh, aren't we wonderful? People love Coventry. They're coming here more than any other place in the country except London. So, but if you ask the careful question, well, who are these people? You find, well, they don't go to A&E, they don't vote, don't have babies, don't send children to school, don't buy houses, don't use gas and electric, don't claim state pension or employment support allowance, and they don't put extra waste into their bins. If they exist, they are ghosts or vampires who leave no trace. Next question, next slide, please. And this is just another way of looking at the same issue, of kind of going back to the question at the beginning, is this credible? So here we are, 2019 data, and saying, well, if all these people had come to Coventry, where are they living? And you look at the table below, and you see that ONS in their mid-year estimates are saying there are 371,521 people here now. And if that were true, based on average occupancy, you'd say, well, we need 22,618 homes, to accommodate them. But in actual fact, over that same period since the last sentence, less than half that number of homes have actually been delivered. And that number of 9,218 is actually largely student flats and accommodations. They're not real family homes. They're not real increases in the population of Coventry. They are a transient population which does not tend to increase itself or reproduce itself. So, if there are all these newcomers, are they sleeping under the arches? Well, I live in Coventry. We do have homeless people, but they're not there in their thousands, fortunately. Next slide. And this is, we've done very detailed analysis, and you can see inside the ONS black box to a small degree. And we can certainly say that ONS is forecasting too many births. It's now about 1,000 per year, and that they have too many students staying on, nearly 4,000 a year, 3,750 in 2019. This is based on pretty good data. You can get good hard data from the Higher Education and Statistics Authority about how many foreign students there are at the universities. There are a vast number in Coventry. After London, we have more foreign students than any other city in the country. And how many of them graduate? And then the very key question is, how many of them leave the country after graduating? So ONS has only 2,650 people leaving per year of all kinds of international immigrants, students, workers, family leavers, all sorts. But we know from the HESA data and from Home Office exit checks data done at the border that more than double that number are actually leaving. So every single year, at least in 2019, there were 3,750 people who left Coventry after graduating from university, but they were not accounted for in the SNPP. Effectively, they were left here bloating the population numbers. Next slide. So you may wonder, well, is this all crackpot stuff? Is this validated? It has been peer reviewed. You've got at least 4 well-known academics, who've said, yeah, it's good. Your analysis is as good as it could be. Your challenge seems highly valid. Your evidence is compelling. The ONS response is poor. So that takes us to the next thing. Next slide, please. So we learned a lot about ONS and how they responded to us, because we innocently and naively thought, well, if we go to ONS and we point out the problems with this stuff, they'll correct it. We respect them. We think they're scientific. But anyway, we started having meetings with them in 2018. Our MPs wrote to them. Andy Street, the mayor of the West Midlands, wrote to them with their concerns. People did the same in Wirral and Guildford, we were aware of, saying, look, really, you've got these huge population increases, and we don't think it's true for lots of reasons. And I made an FOI request of ONS asking to see their internal emails. And so we got a lot of information back. So this is how ONS responded. This is not showing me what I want to see. I'm going to just go somewhere else and try to find it. Give me one moment. I'm going to need to read from a different slide. Excuse me. This is the hazard of the technology. Almost there. Okay, yeah. So we know that these three towns challenged ONS. Others may have done so. And these were comments being made inside of ONS. Well, in the first instance, all three of us, got a big fob off. You get a letter saying, well, we welcome feedback, but there's never any substantive reply. There's never anyone who says back, well, this assumption's wrong, or this data is incorrect, or this calculation has missed something out. You've missed this factor. You haven't understood this or that. Never anything like that. And they never showed us their calculation either. We asked many times, show us the calculation, show us your working. So if you're doing GCSE maths, you've got to show your working, but not ONS. And these are some of the internal comments. So one manager wrote to another saying, well, the biggest qualm we've heard is feedback for all ONS outputs. Remember that, it's for all ONS outputs. So that's population, commerce, inflation, anything else they're doing, has been that, quote, ONS is willing to hear what people say, but seems to do literally nothing with it. They just do what they were going to do anyway, with a very broad brush and little local insight. In one instance with Manchester, that led to a somewhat vigorous, bristled debate. And another manager wrote, it makes me wonder whether we really have a complaints procedure. And then the same person later added, maybe I'm getting too used to the Weasley words approach. Next slide, please. Well, having gotten nowhere with ONS, having made a couple presentations of all this material at the British Society for Population Studies, still getting nowhere, we made a complaint to the UK Statistics Authority and the Office of Statistics Regulation, which is supposed to oversee and regulate ONS. And after 6 months, they issued a report, and it supported us, but not with very strong words. We really wanted someone to say that the ONS, mid-year estimates and the population projections have serious defects, because we wanted to go to court. We wanted to stop building on Greenbelt. We wanted to be able to say, there's no need for all these homes. But the conclusions did support us, but not terrible in strong language. So the report said, Coventry did seem to be inconsistent with the figures, the population estimates did seem to be inconsistent with and potentially higher than local evidence would suggest. So that's all the stuff I showed you. And this also appeared to be the case in a number of smaller cities with large student populations. Then it goes on to say, in polite words that they fobbed us off, ONS did not adequately consider your concerns and more needs to be done to investigate the root and scale of the issue. Well, from FOI, this is what ONS actually thought. The fixes have not done enough to address the overestimation of these groups in some areas. Quote, this has led to an over-reliance on insufficiently robust data to informing local planning decisions, such as the need to build additional schools and housing. So that was taken from the first draft of the investigation report, and it was removed at the request of ONS. Now, I think that's really wonderful that the people being investigated get to edit the investigator's report. I'm sure all bank robbers would love to be able to go to the police and to revise the charge sheet. And then it goes on, there are other things. They said, we are convinced there is an issue with Coventry's figures and the local, I can't read the next bit because of the way Microsoft Teams. Anyway, they were convinced there was an issue, but it didn't appear in the final report. Next slide, please. And these are some more things that ONS said in private about their attitude towards a reasoned, expert-supported argument with their figures. So ONS says, do we need to say clearly to people that we don't intend on introducing a bespoke local authority method for some areas? No, we're not going to budge. We're not going to change. It's worth being aware that we'll not be making changes to the way we produce estimates for mid-2020, except in response to pandemic-related data issues. And this is my favorite one, which summarizes hundreds of emails. This is from Rich Pereira, who is the director of their population division. I've not named the people in the other bits because I don't want to blacken their names. But I think Rich Pereira is really the one responsible for all this. And he writes in response to a journalist who asked about, are there plans to correct the mid-year estimates? His reply was, plans to correct implies an error of which we have made none. Let me repeat that. This is the director of ONS saying, we have made no mistakes. We will not correct anything. So that's a pretty papal position. And then below it, you can see a little summary of where the figures are. What are we moaning about? And that in 2020, ONS are saying there are 379,000 people in Coventry. Our best estimate, based on the number of places, houses built, number of places where newcomers can come and live, is around 335,000. And the starting point for that was 317,000 at the 2011 census. So there's a vast and yawning gulf between us and between what ONS are saying. And the real killer here is that ONS went ahead 6 weeks after the investigation reported, said there was an issue in Coventry, and said the figures seemed to be too high. They went ahead and they published their 2020 numbers without any qualification. They didn't warn the users that there was likely to be a problem in Coventry and other places with large student populations, places like Sheffield or Oxford or Cambridge or Exeter. There are many of them. You'll see them in another slide in a moment. They didn't do anything at all to tell the public that the numbers were untrustworthy and had been found to be so by an investigation from the official regulator. Next slide, please. So you may wonder, is this news? Am I revealing a new scandal? And sadly, this is an old problem. And here are just some quotes over time. In 2017, Andrew Tyree, then a member of Parliament and chair of the Treasury Select Committee, said, the ONS has fallen a long way short, lacking intellectual curiosity, prone to silly mistakes, and unresponsive to the needs of consumers of its statistics. And in 2013, the RSA, the Royal Statistical Society, said, for some local authority areas, the census has shown that the ONS population estimates have misrepresented the level of population growth. Listen to that again. The ONS population estimates have misrepresented the level of population growth. And then finally, the one I'll quote to you is Professor David Coleman, very distinguished emeritus professor at Oxford of demography. Back in 2007, he testified to a parliamentary committee. All aspects of population statistics in the United Kingdom are in an unsatisfactory state. Even the 2001 census, designed to be infallible, has had to be revised twice, and incompatibilities with other sources patched up with statistical polyfiller. It's not news. ONS is not listening, not responding. They're just digging in. Next slide, please. This is the end. If you're watching this, you may be wondering, well, things are bad in Coventry. Is there something wrong where I live? And this is my best guess. It's a rough and ready estimation. I wouldn't swear hand on heart this is absolutely correct, but I think it is pretty indicative. it is something which is telling you, go and have a careful check if you're on this list. This shows 20 places where I think there's a problem with either the number of students coming in and going out, a problem with the number of births being counted, and as well with the number of deaths occurring. One other problem that ONS has is that they're too optimistic about how long people are going to live. So people are dying sooner than estimated, which pushes down population growth if people are dying. And just for example, you look up the very top line is for Coventry. The blue bit is showing the excess births being added into the estimates. The red segment shows the people who have died, who aren't here anymore, who are still shown as being alive in the estimates. And the yellow line shows all the students who graduated and left Coventry, who aren't around anymore after graduation. And the same applies to all those other towns. So this is easier to see or to calculate, especially for the students in small and medium-sized towns. For large places, it's harder to pick up the signal. You know, it's a rock in a bigger pond, so that it's harder to see what's going on. But nonetheless, there are many places where there are manifest problems. You know, one could have great confidence about the birth and death figures. Those are very accurate figures. So in Birmingham, I can't tell you what the students are doing. The place is too big. The effect gets swamped out. But nonetheless, I can tell you ONS is reporting far too many births and not enough deaths. And so it goes on through that chart. And I'm happy to share the spreadsheet and the figures about all of these if you would like it. Next slide, please. So the question, does all of this matter? This is a death sentence for the green belt around Coventry. The Coventry Council, Warwick District Council, Nuneaton, and North Warwickshire jointly took out a huge amount of land from green belt around Coventry, allegedly because of the huge population need. We need to build houses for all this population growth. And Shakespeare's Forest Arden will be decimated. It is an utter tragedy, and nobody was listening. People used the ONS figures for partisan political ends. You know, the Ministry for Housing wants lots of homes to build. They think it's good politics, so they're all in favor. They won't intervene. Coventry City Council thinks, oh my God, we're going to become important. We're going to outshine Birmingham. You know, we're going to get to our proper place in the sun. And ONS was well aware of why it matters, of how destructive this would be. And they have the chutzpah to tell us that their whole raison d'etre is better data, better decisions. We went to them and showed them this was going to be a very bad decision, being made on the back of their population data. You know, in the draft, the UK Statistics Authority found in favor of us that the data was not robust enough to make planning decisions based on it. And yet ONS would not budge. They didn't issue any kind of an acknowledgement of the problems about it. There are all kinds of little trivial notes in the ONS documents, you know, about that there are Coventry students. Some of them are living in Leamington Spa, you know, so they may be counted in the wrong place, but nothing at all about the big disaster coming and their role in it. Next slide, please. So here you go. If you have questions, be in touch. You've got here my email and phone numbers. I'm really happy to share my thinking and detailed research. And at least some of my documents are on this website, coventrygreenbelt.org. It's not completely up to date. This slideshow needs to go on there. There are previous versions of the slideshow up there. Yeah, I'd happy to be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Merle. I'm going to hand on to our final two speakers, Andrew Wood and Jackie Copley from the CPRE, the Countryside Charity, and we're going to focus now on the social and economic and environmental costs of confusing housing demand with housing need. Thanks very much. Andrew, I think you're leading off.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my slides?
We can, yes.
Okay, thanks. So the role of the planning system in all this is, I would argue, is to mediate and get the right balance between many competing objectives. It's not simply to facilitate the market, and it's time to get to grips with that, and that's basically what I want to talk about. And this photo on the title slide, this kind of perfectly sums up for me how catastrophically out of skew our approach to our homes is with the world that they exist in. For many, it's a pipe dream to have a garden of your own, and for those who do have a garden, their concept of living in it seems to involve banishing all other life forms from it, which seems totally messed up. We do need to build housing that is socially and environmentally beneficial, and that means we also need to not build housing that isn't beneficial, and that might in turn mean the market as something to be actively reshaped, not simply responded to. What's also messed up is the yawning scale of social inequalities. This shows there are different experiences depending on your sort of social background. That can have an ethnic sort of dimension to it, but in a often exploitative sort of private rented sector, this can lead to people having very different living experiences. But if you look at the overall figure here, around 1 in 5 households are living in homes that don't qualify as being decent, and that's scandalous. It's not a deficit of quantity, it's a deficit of standards and regulations. About a quarter of all homes have an energy efficiency rating of E or worse. We have the worst housing stock in Europe, and even in the midst of this sort of crisis that we're in now in terms of energy and in terms of cost of living, the government's doing virtually nothing about it. And again, that's a deficit not of quantity, but of standards and regulation and of political will, really. Homes are still getting less accessible by public transport, and therefore they're getting more car dependent. It's a worse impact in rural areas. This is an environmental problem, of course, increasing congestion, air quality, carbon emissions, and so on. But there's obviously the social impact here too, leaving people isolated, especially younger people, and forcing people to take on the financial burdens of running one or more cars. A combination of car dependency and a lack of care for the design of spaces between buildings means that fundamental human needs for social interaction and so on, for play, are being undermined and ignored. And we are building very bad places generally. Some commentators argue that the Greenbelt and more widely the policy constraints on greenfield land development are directly limiting society's ability to meet these social needs. But this piece of work here from CPRE shows that when land is taken from the Greenbelt for housing, what actually happens is that this kind of shared public good, access to open space and nature, is traded for the privatized space of these kind of car dependent spaces. And I always say to justify exceptional circumstances for removing land from Greenbelt, we need to see exceptional outcomes in terms of sustainable development. And at present, to be honest, we're seeing the opposite, and that's something that the planning system needs to urgently address. We're not simply building. we're not building homes with kind of climate resilience in mind. Look at this picture, there's not a solar panel in sight, there's inefficient building form. I'm not sure what happened to the sustainable drainage. While we know that the system is weak on things like climate resilience and on car dependence, on the other hand, authorities do have clear policy expectations for the proportion of new homes that should be affordable. This piece of work by the New Economics Foundation is intended to show that higher building costs arising from things like Brexit and the pandemic, and also possibly now from war, will slash affordable housing delivery. But I think this map actually shows a different and even worse story. Look at how many authorities were already delivering a tiny fraction of their policy levels for affordable homes before these multiple crises hit. What's the point, I would ask, of these policies being in plans if they're not going to be implemented? Or to put it another way, who actually benefits from these policies not being implemented? And there's really only one answer to that. And frankly, it's scandalous, and the government is doing next to nothing about it. And this is what happens when there's a lack of regulation and a lack of implementation of regulation. But what I really want to say about this picture is that people are not, they not only need these decent, safe homes they can afford, but they are also demanding them. Look at Insulate Britain, look at the anger that came out of the Grenfell disaster. The market-led notion of demand is a distraction from what people are legitimately demanding. So in fact, the system is neither meeting real needs nor real demands, and I think that's something that some of the previous speakers have touched on as well. So these are rhetorical questions, of course. How many homes should we build that don't meet people's needs and don't meet these big societal challenges? I would argue that the answer is zero. We shouldn't be building any houses that don't meet these needs. And if you think how harmful not meeting these needs is, how do these harmful impacts outweigh the benefits of meeting numerical targets? Well, it's not to say we should stop building homes. Of course we should build homes, but we urgently need to stop building unsustainable, unaffordable homes on the pretense that meeting the numerical target is the same as meeting either need or demand. So I'm going to hand over to Jackie. I think I still need to operate the slides, but she's going to tell you about how this is playing out in the Northwest and some great work that she's done there on sort of tackling weaknesses in the evidence base. So over to Jackie.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, my job is a planning manager looking after the countryside of the Lancashire area surrounded in red and the Cheshire area surrounded in orange. We've got very key cities: Blackpool, Blackburn, Chester, Lancaster, Liverpool, Manchester, Preston and surrounding towns. And because of their role in the Industrial Revolution, we have got significant amounts of brownfield land available. And we also have really nice countryside in the areas of the Forest of Bowland, Fylde Peninsula, West Lancashire, where the national asset of Grade 1 agricultural land is located. We've got the Pennine Hills and the Cheshire Plain out to the Wirral Peninsula. So we've got some lovely countryside. And the aim of CPRE is to, yes, ensure enough houses are planned, but making sure they come forward in the right locations, reusing brownfield land, ensuring our cities and towns are regenerated. But it does seem that developers do target housing in rural areas, and that's as a consequence of land being able to be bought at affordable prices at agricultural land values, seeking consent and selling on houses for a much higher profit. It's much more profitable to build a 4-bed house in the countryside than it is in the cities or towns. Next slide, please, Andrew. So this slide here basically shows coloration of the same geography, showing which areas are rural and which are urban. You can see the dark blue strip, which basically goes from the west, where we have Liverpool, through to the central area of Greater Manchester. Those are our very large conurbations, and the areas identified in the green are our more rural. So we've got rural Wyre in the lime green and Ribble Valley. Now, if the government policy of focusing land in brownfield areas is working, we would see, when we look at the housing delivery test, more houses being provided in those locations where, if you go to the next slide, Andrew, this is a difficult slide for you to see, but I will circulate it so you can see it in more detail. Every year, our government has a housing delivery test. It basically looks at how many houses have been identified in the housing requirement and how many completions have been recorded. Now, at the top of that table is Burnley with 434% housing delivery. And then we have Knowsley Preston, but we also have Ribble Valley, which has exceeded its target by 369%. So we're seeing, and at the bottom of the table, which is showing lower ranking performance, the blue shades, that's all our brownfield sites. Now, if government policy was working, we should be seeing those blue authorities at the top and the greens and the light blues and the greys towards the bottom of the table. So, you know, we've set out, we can show through our own work that the national planning policy target of government is focusing the countryside, and it is borne out by us planning for demand and not need. So, Andrew, if you go to the next slide, please. Focusing on particularly on our geographies, we've got the Lancashire area. All of the authorities have exceeded. Sorry, I can't see what I'm reading because Jenny Nichols is trying. Sorry. Again, I'll quickly get through it because I want to get onto the question stages. Of course, we have to plan for housing, but all of the authorities that are considered more rural are exceeding their targets. In Ribble Valley, we've seen this, you know, delivering 4 times the amount of housing that it should. And if you look at each local authority has an annual monitoring report, and we can see that before 2012, when we had the coalition government and the introduction of the National Planning Policy Framework, we had the Northwest Regional Assembly, the Northwest Regional Spatial Strategy, which had brownfield targets, and regularly Ribble Valley was achieving a very high brownfield performance. And since the introduction of National Planning Policy Framework, there is no requirement for a brownfield target, and therefore in the Ribble Valley, the amount of land used for delivery of housing has reduced substantially. It's now below 50%, whereas before it was up to 97, 98%. What we are seeing is a lot of off local plan sites coming forward as a consequence of the working of the housing delivery test. And local authorities are no longer refusing applications on land that's not in the local plan. Local plans being the mechanism to guide decisions. They're basically surrendering because without a high level of housing performance, they know if a developer goes to an appeal of a refusal, it's likely they will gain consent. And in the Liverpool City area, you can see West Lancashire in the purple. That has actually now been attached to, it's not even in the Liverpool City region, but it's now been identified as being part of the functioning housing and market area. And despite the fact I mentioned earlier, it's got the highest grade land in the country with grade 1, that is being now identified for housing, which seems to be perverse. If you can move on to the next slide, Andrew. Again, in the Liverpool City region, there is a Liverpool City region-wide strategic housing employment land market assessment, which in all cases, it basically looks at an accelerated growth curve for the economy. And as a consequence of that, the housing figures have been substantially hiked. And whereas it's very opaque because the modelling that has been done through Oxford Economics is almost like black box analysis. But all we can see is previously Merle was talking about ONS. Now, I would say ONS is a fair guide to statistics, but you have to look at a range of indicators. You have to look at migration, you have to look at your demographics, and you also have to look at economic policies. But effectively, Liverpool City region has got such ambitious targets, we think in reality it would not occur. In fact, at the Liverpool local plan examination, the author, G.L. Hearn, was at the examination, and they said if their report had been written today, it wouldn't suggest such high growth because we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, and we've now got the Ukrainian invasion, which is causing significant economic uncertainty. So in Liverpool, we're planning for way too many houses. In Wirral, houses are being planned at 4 times the amount that are actually required as a consequence of the government standard method. So Andrew, if you just go on to the next slide, I think I'm nearly done. And the same is true in Greater Manchester. We hired a demographer, Pierce Elias, who looked at the use of the standard method and the figures that are being used and just identified flaws up to the tune of 30,000 houses. And when the next version of the plan that has now been submitted to Secretary of State was submitted, they have actually reduced the figure by 30,000. So we know there are issues with the way housing numbers are planned. But, you know, CPRE will work. And again, I think the issue of affordability is something that we need to deal with. So if you could, next slide, Andrew, I think that's... And again, Cheshire, there's a slide there. I will include them in the slides I hand out, but it's just to go to show that the more rural places of Cheshire East and Cheshire West have got the very high housing performance, whereas Warrington, Trafford and Stockport and Wirral, all brownfield areas, they have got the low performing completion. So there's a mismatch in what the government is trying to achieve. Simply, its housing policy isn't working because houses are coming forward in the wrong locations. Last slide, Andrew, please. So on demand side, when I talk about demand, I'm talking about in a local plan identifying how many houses need to be planned for over a 15-year period of a local plan. It is government's best practice to use up-to-date data, but relying on this Office of National Statistics 2014 data, we know that it's reliant on very high growth. We have previously used demographers to unpick the evidence base of local authorities and found flaws. But as a rural organisation, we do identify we do need rural housing. We need affordable rural housing, and we don't agree with the government's definition of first-time buyers because that isn't in perpetuity affordable housing. And then on the supply side, we've developed a brownfield toolkit to help identify more sites. But there is an issue that the government, when putting together data for brownfield, it considers an awful lot of sites as unsuitable. Anyway, and just 2 last things. We want more brownfield, and we think more houses can be provided at density, but in a quality way, not in a Grenfell Tower way. Back to you, Andrew.
I did have a couple of extra slides, but I think in order to leave time for the panel discussion, I think I'll just leave them because I think actually your slides have summed up what we wanted to say very well anyway. So I'll just leave it there and we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Andrew and Jackie. So we're going to move to a panel discussion and question and answers. And can I introduce my colleague Donna Lee at this stage? Now, Donna's got the unenviable task of trying to distinguish the questions from the comments in the chat. So Donna, do you want to do the best you can and start us off?
I was just going to say to everybody, there's been a lot of debate going on during this session. There is a lot of information in the chat. Obviously, we haven't got time to read out everybody's comments. So I'm thinking probably the fairest thing to do is if I go back to the start of the session and I'm just going to, at random, just pick a couple of points because I really honestly don't think we could get through all the discussion that's happened this afternoon. So I'm going to go back to the very start of the session, and Sean wanted to know, is most social housing not now supplied by S106 with market housing now, which arguably also meets a need?
Thanks, Donna. So let's direct that to Peter to start with, because Peter, you were talking about the role of housing associations in providing affordable or not affordable housing. Thanks.
Now, the question was about the amount of affordable housing that's supplied by 100% by the social housing sector, and how much of it is supplied as part of the in the gift of the developers, as part of a wider development. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But just to reiterate, I think as you can see, the amount of social housing when it comes to new social housing, when it comes to meeting the needs, how to describe them, is so small, it sort of doesn't matter very much. My guess is that about 80 or 90% of the social housing that is provided comes through Section 106 affordable agreements, which is another problem that the industry faces, because the arguments go on for years and years and years over what can be afforded and what can't.
Thanks, Peter. Jackie.
Yes, hi. I was just going to say, NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, requires all developments to bring forward 10% affordable housing. Now, local plans will vary depending on the location, but the mechanism is usually it should be designed in, because the NPPF says there wants to be balanced communities, but some developers will offer not to build on site, but to offer a Section 106 to pick up elsewhere. But the issue is local authorities, although new powers have recently been brought in, they're not set up to deliver houses. They're not house builders, and all social housing is now at arm's reach. It's through registered providers, and they simply don't have the finance to be able to bring forward. So we are seeing a depletion of affordable housing, and the right to buy is a policy we feel ought to be scrapped in rural areas in particular, because it's led to a complete depletion of rural houses in particular areas. And we know in rural areas, house prices have outstripped wage increases by, more than 11 times. So it is causing problems. The other thing is, of course, is a developer can get a grant of permission on the basis of a housing contribution, and then at a later time come back, renege on it, because they can say, well, it's now not viable for whatever reason. And so the viability focus of the NPPF is also not helpful, because affordable housing is the first element to get dropped. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And Andrew, you showed in your slides, didn't you, a snapshot of local authorities and the actual delivery of affordable houses compared to their strategic targets for affordable housing, and a complete failure all round, it looked like, didn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And I think actually somebody in the chat's mentioned strategic housing market assessments, and I think the thing is that what tends to happen is that the need for affordable housing is basically rolled into the overall housing number, and then that's kind of translated into the housing requirement, which then the dominance of the market over land supply basically goes, right, we turn that overall number into land supply for the market, and then they don't actually deliver on the affordables. And so in purely numerical terms, the affordable housing requirement is not being met through that kind of process. And I mean, I think that a way forward for that is to actually find a way of sort of segregating out the two types of need, and we need to look at how some potential changes to the planning system might potentially sort of address that, but I don't think we've got the answers to that yet.
Thanks very much, Andrew. over back to you, Donna, if you can find us another question.
Yeah, okay, we've got another one here. One of our delegates has asked, of the total number of homes in the UK, how many are not being used by families as homes and how many are investments and empty?
Now, who wants to? Yes, Peter.
Am I on still?
You are.
I think our first speaker suggested about 18% of homes are institutional homes rather than homes that people live in. So I think the answer is 18% of houses that aren't being, well, you might say properly used, but not used.
And Jackie?
Yeah, it's actually a difficult figure. I can see David's come on, so he can answer in a minute. But each local authority has this annual monitoring report, and in there, the level of vacancy of property is identified. But a house or a property that has been bought by, say, an investment pension fund may well be kept unoccupied but not declared as vacant. So it's a moot point.
Thanks. David, I'm sorry we kind of lost you there. I think that was possibly my fault. I think you disappeared into the ether. Do you want to come in on this? And your microphone's off, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, the short answer is it really varies radically by place. And there's also not great figures about it as well. I mean, I think it is one of those many questions about housing politics where just generating data is part of responding to it. But yeah, I mean, it's not, you can't really give one figure for that.
Thanks very much, David. Back to you, Donna.
Yep, just looking through. We've got lots of points, but I'm just trying to filter out questions.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just going past all the parts where we couldn't hear somebody's slides.
Yes, I don't know. I think that's I'm not sure. It's not a problem from our end on the slide thing. I think some people might need to press a particular button on their whatever device they're using. You found us a question?
Yeah. Are births constrained by poor housing? We have a fertility issue due to the housing supply issue.
So the question for Merle, I think, is, and then we'll bring Jackie in. Births.
I have no idea. You know, I know I am aware of how many people are being born, but why those numbers are changing, I can't tell you. I can tell you that fertility ratios are dropping. And that seems to be a general phenomenon from Radio 4, you know, throughout the world. But that's as far as my knowledge goes.
So there's a problem with the circularity of using household formation, isn't there? That households form when they can afford to move out, and therefore, you know, that's not a reliable statistical basis. Jackie.
There is a link between poor housing and inner city deprived areas and higher mortality. Generally, people die younger and health problems are poorer. So there is a link to that. But in terms of birth rate, we have a ageing population structure in the whole of the UK. When you look at the demographic maps, you can clearly see that when you look at economically active groups of population, it is dwindling. And that is the reason that the government has a growth policy. Its manifesto was for growth, and that is why it's planning for growth. But it cannot be true that all parts of the UK can simultaneously plan for growth and all houses be filled if you're not going to have a policy of mass immigration, and we don't currently have that. And our birth rate is reducing because as basically when you move from an agricultural economy where people have 10 kids to it's to do with survival and ensuring that older members of the family have people coming through able to look after them, in developed countries, birth rates reduce and people tend to have 2.2 kids. So it's a factor of developing nations and as to why people have a reduced birth rate. I mean, many people are choosing not to have children now because of climate change reasons, and so it is going to be interesting to see that. And by the way, Coventry, wasn't it supposed to be the capital of culture? Maybe that's why it was planning for growth in such a ambitious fashion.
That could be it, couldn't it? So there's also a link, isn't there, between planning for housing need and planning for particular demographic need. And does anyone want to talk about this, the issue particularly of an aging population? To what extent is that reflected in planning policy for housing supply? David.
Well, it's not just aging. I mean, there's a whole sort of politics of who's being imagined as the new residents who are going to move into British cities. And I mean, if you look at cities like London and Manchester and places that are building new housing in the center of cities, they're generally not building for families. They're certainly not building for working class families, as Peter and others have discussed. I mean, I think it does influence the future of these places. It influences who's going to be able to live in there. Obviously, there's not a completely deterministic relationship between housing morphology and household, but there, in a very basic sense, it is true that cities are building housing for a pretty narrow sort of band of type of city dweller, and it's again really not meeting the needs of the sorts of households that cities really depend upon to operate. You genuinely cannot just have a city composed only of affluent single people. It just won't work.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Peter.
I just wanted to say you can get really bogged down in the numbers if you start to debate them. I think that how many angels can you get in a pinhead when you start talking about things like the number of household formations, the need, the demand, and things like that. I think the bottom line at the moment is that the system itself is more dysfunctional now than it has been probably for nearly 100 years, actually. And I think back in the 1910s and 20s, homes for heroes was the idea. There was a man called Tudor Walters who designed them, and he said they should be this big and that wide, and they should have gardens, which is one of my bugbears. The other being they should all have plenty of places to park your cars as well, but that's an argument I've had with the CPRE before. I think that we've completely lost the ability to build houses for that bottom, let's say, not say 20%, let's say 30 to 35%. They're completely ignored now, not just in the planning system, but even by people who design houses. We don't design houses for families anymore, and we don't care about the size of them, and we don't care how tightly packed they are together. And that's why, just to go back to a last plug for the book, we thought there were three things that needed doing. One is that the minimum space standard should be raised by 20%. We thought that the maximum density should be lowered by 20%, back to where they were in the 90s. They've gone up from 20 odd to 40 odd now. I think if I've got a village being built near me where people are protesting about it, they've already buying the land on the basis of 40 houses to the hectare, which is going to fix that place as a place full of tiny little boxes. So I think that until people start looking to deliver houses, the people in need of the bottom third, let's say, nothing beyond a little fiddling around is being done for the bottom third. And the only answer, after 180 pages of discussions and talking to lots of people, ministers, developers and all that sort of thing, is council, you don't call them council houses, but houses rented in perpetuity on land that has been bought at agricultural land value or existing use value and is be able to be rented out about half the local market rent. If you can't do that, you're never going to get anywhere.
Thanks, Peter. Jackie, Andrew, I've got you. Jackie, I think you wanted to come in first.
Yeah, well, I'd let Andrew, because I've spoken. I'll talk after him.
And he has had his hand up for about 10 hours. So
let him go first.
Yeah, I've got a special kind of arm wrestle here. Yeah, it was just to say, I think in terms of how it works in planning, with a bit of an exception around sort of housing, sort of sheltered housing, as it were, for older people who kind of have specific needs. With that exception, housing is basically considered to be one thing, one form of development in relation to the use class and so on. And a bit, as I said earlier, the volume builders with their very narrow solutions go, well, here's the big number and here's how much land we need to meet that big number. And I think this prevents land being available and viable for the provision of other types of housing that don't fit that model. And so consequently, those other potential providers are left sort of at the margins, and they're not influencing the planning system. They're not, their voice is not heard in the planning system, so they don't get the opportunity to diversify the housing that's on offer. So we end up with a sort of one size, solution to a problem which is actually very diverse.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Sorry, Peter, did you want to come back in?
I don't know. No, I'll leave it. I'll just stop thinking again. No, I'll stop.
Jackie.
May I was just going to say, I think probably you shouldn't have us on the panel. You should be getting the 6 cartel massive house builders here and saying, why are you not building housing for those cohorts? Because they're not. They make more money. It's commodity. They make more money shelling out, family executive homes a million miles away on farmland, expecting people to drive in their car. And it's completely, we don't have a planning system, actually. We have a government that bends the rules to fit around its donors. And the problem is now an acceleration of countryside loss and younger cohorts not having anywhere to live. And, we ought to be freeing up older people's, empty nest homes, massive 4, 5, 6 bed home, by providing quality, interesting housing options for those older groups to move into. So there are solutions to all of this, but we're not planning for people. We're not planning for the environment. We're planning so those 6 big cartels can make lots of money.
I know what I wanted to say now. I wanted to say a couple of things. One was, do not blame the planning system for not bringing forward homes. The big house builders certainly do. Look how many homes they build each year, and look how their land banks do not fall. In other words, there's enough land for the big house builders, at least, and probably the smaller ones, to go round. So there's these endless arguments about making the planning system better. Fortunately, even Michael Gove has decided that's a bad idea now and has abandoned most of the plans that he had. And I think this idea, and the other thing I wanted to say was this idea that it seems to me that you're coming from a position where it will be good for everybody if they did this. If they washed their hands and combed their hair properly and didn't drive cars and walked to work and didn't mind living in little houses, everything would be fine. Well, that's not how people live and work. People are free to do what they can within the limits that they have. People choose to drive cars. People choose to do this and that. And this sort of idea that we can be benevolent about them and make them do other things, I think is just wrong. The ghosts aren't just the people at the bottom of the heap. The ghosts are those in the middle and the top. They want to do what they want to do, And if you live in a town, yes, you don't need a car. But if you live in a village, even if you're poor, you need a car. So I don't think we should be sort of hoping that people will do the right thing and our housing policy will change. That's it. That's the second and probably the last rant. All right.
Okay, we'll hold you to that, Peter. Thanks very much. Okay, back to you, Donna. Let's see if you can find us another question.
Yeah, well, I've actually found more a comment really, but I thought this might provide a bit of debate. So somebody has said, our experience in Devon is that local authorities are only concerned to deliver the number of new homes they've been instructed to deliver, because then they receive money from the government via the new homes bonus. Yeah. If they over deliver, which every district council in Devon has done, then they get more money, and that's all that matters to them.
Okay, so that's local authorities influenced by the new homes bonus. Now, who wants to take that point? Yes, Peter.
I could have a go. I was involved with Grant Shapps when he invented it about 2012, and this was Grant Shapps' big idea, was that local authorities would be persuaded to give planning permissions in return for being getting some relief on the council tax or something like that. Anyway, it's still chugging along. If you look at the numbers, there are billions of pounds have been not sent back to the Treasury by these people who are doing this. Does anybody think it's made the slightest difference to Mr. and Mrs. Jones on the planning committee when they're deciding to say yes or no to a development? I don't think it has. I think it's been one of the biggest flops of all time. Nobody talks about it. Does anybody talk about it? Jackie, have you actually found a council going, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll give that one planning because we're going to get the council tax back.
Yeah, it does come up. We get inquirers saying that they think there's a conflict of interest, because even in planning statements of large major housing estates, it will be identified how much revenue. For example, Leverhulme Estates in Wirral, if you look at their vision for a lot of greenfield development, they quantify how much revenue Wirral Council would get as a consequence. So we've obviously weighed in and say that's not how planning decisions should be made.
It's a fraud.
Yeah, and I was also just going to qualify, when we don't talk about high density, I mean, if you look at the borough of Richmond, that has one of the highest density properties, yet they're lovely 3-storey townhouses. You can have really nice, really high quality, high density developments. We're not pushing for the small boxes or, we're all for a good quality of life, but I think there are different models of houses. And I think I might choose to disagree where you look at the big number of houses. I think that's why we are where we are, because the government has said it's mandated the use of the Office of National Statistics 2014 figures, which is based on this very high growth, pointing to an annual national housing requirement of 300,000, whereas if you use 2020 figures, you'd be looking at less than 200,000, more like 160,000, and that is obviously not what the government is after. It's after a higher number based on high growth. So, I think at the end of the day, we ought to be ensuring enough homes are built, but I think you can't fudge it and use inaccurate data. You have to try and be as, at the end, it's all finger in the air stuff, but you have to use the best indicators you can to try and plan over the next 15 years.
Thank you, Jackie, which goes back to kind of Merle's presentation, doesn't it? Just on the issue of, if not the new homes bonus, then the revenue generated from new homes. This does seem to be evidence that that's influencing some gentrification or state-led gentrification. David, you were talking about the kind of imagined residents, particularly of urban development. The sort of young professional still seems to be very much kind of the beneficiary of some of the apartment building funded by investment trusts. Would you say?
Yeah, well, and a lot of the building that councils are doing as well ends up being, I mean, at least in London, ends up being market rate housing that they're building, and they're. I mean, I think with a lot of regeneration schemes, there's this idea that market rate housing will come first, and it will cross subsidize, slightly subsidized housing, but often that never gets built or doesn't get built at the original scale, and the end result is that the truly social housing just never really appears in any significant extent. I mean, I really don't think that the current system can be tweaked a little bit to sort of improve things. There needs to be a completely different mode of delivering social housing and making proper social housing again, and which also depends on tenancy rights and a whole set of political and administrative relationships. It's not just the structures themselves.
So, Peter, a fundamental overhaul of the whole system.
There has been a couple of ideas. One came from Sir Stuart Lipton, a developer who was asked by the government to look at ways in which this whole Section 106 thing could be dealt with. In London now, it takes 19 months between getting planning and getting on site, mainly due to Section 106 disagreements on large sites. It's costly. It's become a little mini industry all of its own, and it's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. Now, Stuart's idea, which was put to government, was looked at by government and was thought to be a good idea and was worked on by government lawyers, was that would all be abandoned and you would simply pay a tax on the value when you sold the house at the end. I thought this was the best idea forever. That one chapter in our book is about land tax and the failure for 100 years to introduce a decent land tax. This seemed to me to be a very good idea. And I was writing a column for a magazine I work for, which has just come out today. And I rang Stuart. I said, "What happened to that idea of yours?" He's dead. It's dead. Just another victim of the changing of the guard from one housing minister to another. A lot of time was spent on that idea. I thought it was a good idea, and it's gone. What needs to be done if you can't do that is the extreme view, which is, I had lunch with this developer, which is the basis of my column. I said to him, if you can't do the affordable, you have to sell the site. It's your risk when you bought the site. You knew what was going to happen, and therefore, if you can't build the affordable, you have to take the loss by selling the site. And I think a few more councils should say to developers, tough nuts, it's your risk, you have to sell the site. Problem with that is you don't get any affordable built. And you get a change of mayor, as in this case, Boris wanted 15, new mayor wanted 30. Site hasn't been built on for 7 years. It can hold over 1,000 houses. Nothing has been built on it. So that's another way, a rather extreme way of stopping this happening. Just tell them to sell the site. Thank you, Peter. Back to you, David.
Yeah, just to come in on that point, I think that is a really good point. And it's also a consequence of the long de-skilling of councils that aren't able to be an alternative anymore. And I mean, I think if it was possible for councils to deliver housing faster and more dependably, then I think some of these things wouldn't happen, because it would be clear that they would be able to step in and build the housing that is needed. So the idea of sort of competing with the private sector was always part of the philosophy of council housing. It wasn't that the state is going to own all housing, but it is going to exercise a benevolent role within housing markets, and it's certainly not doing that now.
Absolutely, they've been destroyed. The ability of councils to build houses has been just about flattened now, and would take 20 years to rebuild. So it's not going to happen, I don't think. Thank you. Andrew, you just wanted to come in?
Yes, I was just going to say as well, I was actually thinking back to Jackie's slides about the difference between different authorities' performance in relation to the housing delivery test, and I get the impression that many local authorities don't feel able to play hardball with developers who actually don't want to provide affordable housing, whatever, because the developer just walks away and then the council fails its housing delivery test. So the ways in which local authorities are penalised for not meeting numerical targets is a fundamental flaw in the system.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
And that's a comment in the chat really about both the 5-year land supply and the housing delivery test. make sure that local planning authorities are very vulnerable to pressure from developers. Donna,
it might be worth
sorry.
just saying, it's not to say, of course, a local authority needs a 5-year housing land supply, but it's the metric in which they have no control over the rate of delivery, yet that's the metric they're performance checked on. So that's what needs to change. Yes, they should have enough for 5 years, but yeah, it's made the planning system very weak because local authorities haven't got the capacity. Their local plan policy is rendered out of date as soon as they fail that test, and it's impossible to achieve the test because the housing numbers are hiked so high.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. Back to you, Donna. See if you can find us another one.
Yeah, I noticed there was a few people sort of discussing the situation with student accommodation. So I thought I'd read this one out. So one of our delegates has said that they were driven out of Canterbury in 2006 when student housing hit our community. It took only 2 years to wreck our community, and I will never live in a university town again. Canterbury is about to build a massive amount of flats in the middle of town only for students. So this will be studio flats rented out for £950 a month. I could write a dissertation about housing problems in general over the last 20 years in this part of Kent and how this came about, which no one seems to be closely examining.
Thanks for that, Donna. So this is purpose-built student accommodation, which relates back to David's point about the investment driving new building, but also it dovetails with Merle's statistics and the role of student numbers in population figures. Who wants to start us off?
Have a go if you like.
Thanks, Peter.
I'm very hard to stop, really. I know you are in Canterbury. I'm not that far from you. I think they should just be taken. They're not part of the housing figures, are they? Student housing. It is a purely investment class, which makes a lot of money for a lot of people. I hope they're not included in housing numbers. Although, are they? Well, that's incredible if they are, because they're not houses at all. Although some of them are now making posher pods and making them like flats. But they do distort the whole area. I mean, my co-author spent many years trying to get some flats built for families in Nottingham, Jackie Sadek, and failed because the locals were worried about the people in the flats causing problems, and eventually she gave up. And guess what the Nottingham Council then did? They allowed somebody to build student accommodation in exactly the same place, which makes it much worse than it would have been if they'd been ordinary flats. Student accommodation is a bit of a plague at the moment. It provides probably the most grotesque architecture I've ever seen, built to enormous heights. And I suppose it will continue. I can't see them going away, but nobody else is ever going to live in them but students.
David.
Yeah, student. I mean, there's a lot of geographers and sociologists writing about studentification of housing in urban areas now, and it certainly can be a form of financialization. I don't know. I mean, as someone who works at a university, I do think it's important that students have housing, but I think it can definitely be organized and planned in a different way. And it's very clear that the sort of model of purpose-built student accommodation right now is, I mean, certainly not connected to university strategies. I mean, it really is just its own little real estate circuit, and yeah, I mean, it's part of the problem.
Thank you, David. Mel, do you want to come in at all on this in terms of student numbers?
Well, not about the student housing, really. I mean, I know about the numbers of students are here, but less about where they're living. I mean, all I can do is make the observation that next to places like Birmingham universities, the local neighborhoods are completely converted to student use, which leads to a very poor quality environment. The students aren't best at keeping the place in a fit state. They're often somewhat antisocial neighbors. I know this is unfair to them, so I don't want to demonize or stigmatize them, but there is that perception. And if you walk down those streets, it's not very nice. The same was true in Coventry. So I think on balance, I would prefer the universities to provide housing rather than having homes converted to student use by carving them up into little student warrens, because that basically destroys a neighborhood. You know, that families who want to live there find it very unpleasant, you know, after that occurs. There's a lot of complaints about it. So I think it's a better solution to have purpose-built student housing than, you know, just taking over the family housing area.
Thanks, Will. So there's a whole raft of issues to talk about in terms of purpose-built student housing and the student rental market. I think we'll move on and ask Donna to try and find us another question.
Yeah, so I've picked something completely different here. So yeah, so this is what evidence is there that house builders are able to acquire greenfield/rural sites at agricultural land values? PDL sites will often attract lower land values due to higher development costs.
Okay, so we'll start off with Jackie, I think. So you were pointing out to grade 1 agricultural land that was going for house building in Lancashire. Your microphone.
Apologies. Yeah, we undertook a piece of research in 2014 looking at the operation of the 5-year housing land supply, and identified that the amount of greenfield development was increasing, brownfield development was going down, and we looked at the land value lift, looking at how to capture land value. And we also talked to local farmers as well, who'd been approached by developers asking to have options on their land should they achieve planning permissions, and then in the event of a grant of permission, they would then purchase the price at a preferable rate. So it's simple economics in terms of buying land. The cheaper you buy the land and the less on cost. And we also did research looking at brownfield as well, because there are a number of myths about abnormal cost exist. There are unknowns on brownfield land, but the government, when it introduced the brownfield registers, looked at understanding constraints better so they could bring sites forward. So there's definitely brownfield sites in urban locations are actually more expensive, even with the constraints, because they're more accessible and more likely to get a high value too. So because they're a higher value to start off with, then they're less attractive as a development prospect.
Thanks, Jackie. Peter, you wanted to come in on this, I think?
Yes, I think the answer to do they buy stuff at agricultural land prices and then build houses on it, they should be so lucky. The landowner is the one that benefits from the increase in value of the land once planning permission has been conferred. And house builders, I just want to explain how that tends to work with the big ones. They will go for land. They will do a provisional agreement with the landowner. They won't pay for the land until it's got full planning permission, and they still won't pay for the land until the Section 106 agreements are done as well, which includes affordable housing. Only then will the land be bought. And those on the other side of the Section 106 table will be able to squeeze lots of affordable houses out of the Section 106 if the land has been bought at a very low price. So you end up with, in funny sort of way, the council, or the social housing provider and the landowner both benefiting from the uplift in the value of the land, and obviously, excuse me, the developer to some extent, because they're making 20% profit on the value of the houses they sell. But anybody who thinks they can buy £1,000 an acre and make 10 times their money is wrong. It doesn't work like that, as many smaller house builders have found out to their cost. You've got the people on both sides tugging away, pulling from the social side to get more affordable housing, and the landowner tugging because it's his land. He wants as much as he can. And they only do the deal after all that's been agreed. And that's basically how it works, really.
Mm-hmm. Possibly worth noting, I don't think it was mentioned, but new homes bonus, that's only applicable to greenfield sites, isn't it?
Is it? Right.
You don't get new homes bonus if you bring a house forward on brownfield site, which again, if you look at the way the Treasury funds housing and its accelerated housing growth fund is all to do with increasing the amount of money available for people to borrow in order to get mortgages on houses. So it's all to do with boosting the developer demand rather than looking at the actual need.
I think we've got a comment in the chat that new homes bonus is available on all sites.
Oh, right, okay. Has that been? It certainly wasn't a couple of years ago, so that must be a recent change.
Okay, we need to check that. Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of pick up a related point actually, which is about the way that the land industry, if you like, sort of it basically dominates the evidence base in terms of the availability of land and its kind of suitability, you know, how it feeds into the planning system. So basically they bring sites forward through the kind of call for sites process. They're involved in the sort of assessment of the merits of those sites in terms of developability and so on, and they lobby for their allocation in the plan, and they also push them through on appeal. So the problem with that is basically that land that isn't of interest to those big players in the land industry generally doesn't actually come into the planning system. And so the question is, where do we get land that isn't of commercial interest to those kind of big players? I'm sure Peter's going to.
I think the one thing that got on the goat of my co-author, Miss Sadek, more than anything else is this sub-industry which lies beneath the house builders or away from most people's perceptions. These are the land promoters, the land aggregators, the land traders. There's a whole bit in the book about them and she hates them. And they make a lot of money. The housing, and the reason they're in that market is because the house builders don't want to be in that market anymore. It all takes too long. So they much prefer, you won't very rarely see a single house builder buy more than a plot from more than 300 or 400 houses. They much prefer to have all that donkey work done by the land promoters, traders, etc., etc. And some of them are quite good. I was looking at Henry Boot's result the other day. I thought they were a builder in the Midlands. They made 17 million profit in the last 6 months on land trading. They're in the land trading market now. They've got 92,000 plots of land. They're only building a couple of 2,000 houses themselves, but land trading is a very profitable business. But just to give a final thing from me on that, there is one good model. There's one outfit that does a good model. Urban and Civic have a very good model of it, which they buy old airfields and do them up. They're now owned by the Wellcome Trust. They are sort of what I would call respectable land traders. They buy huge quantities of land and they try and put together as properly as they can, and they're making a success of it. And they let off plots of 300 or 400 to house builders at a time. But I think it's always a mistake to say, oh, it's the house builder's fault, they own all the land. It's not. There's this other industry sucking land value as well.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's really useful. Back to you, I think, Donna. I think we'll it's coming up for 1:15, so we'll take one more, possibly two more questions.
Yeah, I've got two really good ones here, actually. So the first one is one of our delegates has said, Brexit, COVID and now a war are, of course, all valid reasons for reviewing targets. So why are councils being told to continue with old figures or risk higher targets? And why are the 2014 ONS stats still being used? An element of predetermination to get the highest targets possible, maybe.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Donna. Well, we'll kick off with Andrew. So yes, 2014 basis for household formation.
Thanks. I mean, it's a fairly simple answer, really, which is that the 300,000 is a political, decision as to how many houses the government thinks we should be building. And instead of going, this is, this is the number of houses we want to build, get on and do it. What they're trying to do is kind of keep kind of reverse engineering the numbers from various kind of statistical bases, and which is you end up with things like the 35% urban uplift, which is a completely arbitrary number plucked out of the air in order to make up the numbers. It's like, why not just be sort of honest about the fact that it's a political choice, rather than trying to massage the statistics.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Pete, do I detect a rant coming on, Peter?
Yeah. It's probably, hopefully, my last point that you'll hear. And it is about the Brexit, COVID and war thing. And it's the fact that inflation is now running a little riot. And this came from a developer again in London who said, look, at the moment, if construction inflation is running, I don't know, 10, 15%, a lot, it's quite high, and house prices are flat-ish or flattening, okay? Now, you've got to remember, these guys are looking a year ahead before they decide to build. And what they do is they put these assumptions into their viability models, whether they can start on site. At the moment, they're starting to put in high inflation into the model and low price increases. And it's just beginning to start to say, hang on, this site isn't viable anymore. And what comes next from that is, sorry, Mr. Council, we can't afford as many affordable houses as we thought. Or shall we just leave it for a while? Shall we mothball the site? That's just beginning in London. I don't know whether it's happening anywhere else.
It's one to watch, isn't it? Anyone else want to take us up on this issue? Okay, back to you, Donna, for your second good question.
Yeah, I thought this was really good, actually. Where does infrastructure and amenities come into all of this? We need a holistic approach to building sustainable communities of which affordable housing is a part of, rather than just a push to hit housing targets, which may not be correct in the first place.
Lovely. So I think this was your point, Andrew, wasn't it, in terms of defining need? It's not just about housing need, it's about then how houses fit into everything else. Yeah, I
think that's absolutely true. And somebody in the chat's also mentioned the climate emergency, and I think the issue that we've got here is that basically local authorities are, as we've already mentioned, they're kind of tested in terms of things like 5-year land supply and housing delivery test. They are tested about the numbers in terms of how they meet their targets, and they're penalised for not delivering them. There is no equivalent kind of test in the planning system for achieving things like carbon reduction or walkability or those type of things. There's just no equivalent. And so actually making it as easy as possible for builders to build houses, regardless of the quality, regardless of the placemaking, regardless of the carbon impact. The councils basically have a perverse incentive to allow any old rubbish, really, and that's it's a massive massive problem. The government's tried to do a little bit on it in relation to things like the National Model Design Code, but actually all that's really doing is kind of setting a sort of baseline, which isn't actually particularly exacting a baseline, really. It doesn't really attend to this. It certainly doesn't attend to zero carbon and things like that. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, places where you don't need to have a car, you're not stranded if your your partner's taken the car or whatever. Those types of things is really, really important, and we're just not doing anything about it.
Thanks, Andrew. So final words, anybody on that point? Anybody else want to come in? Jackie.
Yeah, basically, of course, all new development should be supported with adequate developer contributions, and CIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, that was supposed to standardise the amount of developer contribution per square metre of building, but they've found difficulty in its application because some areas are deemed too unviable to even charge CIL. And even if CIL was chargeable, they only anticipate that it would cover 15% of the infrastructure requirements of a local plan. So there's a massive deficit. So that's why Section 106 have continued. And it is problematic because we are seeing CPRE has identified transport desert, so places that don't have enough transport infrastructure. And we are seeing existing towns and cities saying, well, we haven't got capacity for this extra, school places, doctors' surgeries, and there isn't enough capacity coming forward through the current mechanisms. But, it is something we agree that should happen.
Thanks, Jackie. So I'm going to move to a close now. I want to thank all our speakers. Fantastic debate. It's ranged quite widely, I think, from housing supply figures to everything that's wrong with the housing supply system. And as Peter and David have both said, no tinkering is going to make any difference. It needs a fundamental overhaul. One of the key themes that has come out of this afternoon's debate is around land and land value. And I think we need to be following that up. Can I also direct you to the Community Planning Alliance, for whom this seminar series is being held, and they will be organising a webinar later in April on the government's consultation on the Environment Act and moving forward. So that's one to look out for on the Community Planning Alliance website. So can I thank Jackie, Andrew, Merle, Peter, David. Fantastic job, all of you, for dealing with such a complex and wide-ranging subject. Thank you, Liz and Donna, for your sterling work. And thank you, everybody, for participating. We really welcome it. And we'll be back soon, I hope, with getting stuck into some meaty land issues. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye now.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.